Have you ever thought about what the conscience of a country looks like? Well, for India, you'll find it right inside our Constitution. Today, we're diving into the principles that act as the moral compass for our nation, the long-term vision for what India strives to be. We're talking about the Directive Principles of State Policy, or as you'll often see them, the DPSPs.
So, here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll use a simple analogy, the state's manifesto, to get a grip on what DPSPs really are. Then, and this is a big one, we'll compare them to fundamental rights. After that, we'll break them down into three main pillars, figure out how they have any power without courts to back them up, and finally, look at how this vision for India is still changing and growing.
Okay, so let's start with a really simple way to think about this. Imagine the directive principles are like a political party's manifesto. You know, that document they release before an election, filled with all their promises and goals? Well, the DPSPs are kind of like that, but for the Indian state itself, a permanent set of promises to its people.
So, think about it. What happens when a political party doesn't follow through on its manifesto? Can you take them to court? Nope. The only real power you have is at the voting booth, right? You can vote them out. Now hold that thought, because that idea is absolutely key to understanding how directive principles work.
So officially, the DPSPs are laid out in Part 4 of the Constitution, covering Articles 36 to 51. And this is a neat little factoid. The idea was inspired by the Irish Constitution. Now, when the Constitution was being written, the framers faced a huge challenge. They knew a newly independent India just didn't have the money or resources to guarantee every single socioeconomic right from day one. So they made a really smart choice. They made these principles non-enforceable by courts, viewing them as long-term goals for the country to work towards as it grew stronger.
All right, now we get to something that is absolutely crucial to understand, especially for your exams: the difference between fundamental rights and directive principles. The easiest way to remember it is this. Fundamental rights tell the government what it can't do, while directive principles tell the government what it should do. So fundamental rights are mostly negative in nature. They put a fence around the state's power. They say things like, you cannot discriminate, or you cannot take away someone's liberty without due process. They protect you from the state. On the other hand, directive principles are positive. They're a to-do list for the government. They say things like you should work to provide a living wage, or you should secure humane working conditions. They guide the state towards a better future.
This little table really breaks it all down. The biggest difference, and you've got to remember this one, is enforcement. Fundamental rights are justiciable, meaning you can go to court if they're violated. DSPs are non-justiciable. You can't. And that connects to the kind of justice they aim for. Rights are about political justice, your personal freedoms. Directives are about achieving broader social and economic justice, the very soul of a welfare state. You know, this very tension has fueled some of the biggest legal showdowns in India's history, with the Supreme Court constantly trying to find the right balance.
Now, the Constitution itself doesn't neatly label the directive principles, but to make them easy to understand, scholars usually group them into three main ideological buckets: the socialistic, the Gandhian, and the liberal intellectual. Let's take a quick look at each one.
First up, the socialistic principles. These are really the core of the Constitution's dream of a welfare state. They're all about creating a more equal society. For example, Article 39 is a big one. It directs the state to make sure that wealth and resources are shared for the common good, not hoarded by a few. These principles are basically the blueprint for major laws on things like minimum wage, land reforms, and social security.
Second, we have the Gandhian principles, and these are pretty much what they sound like. They reflect the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi, especially his vision of Gram Swaraj, or village self-rule. Article 40, which calls for organizing village panchayats, is the direct constitutional root of the entire Panchayati Raj system we have today. And the focus on cottage industries, that comes straight from his belief in a strong, self-sufficient rural economy. And finally, we have the liberal intellectual principles. These are all about building a modern, rational, and liberal nation. This includes things like Article 50, which calls for a separation between the judiciary and the executive, a cornerstone of a fair legal system. And of course, there's the famous and often debated Article 44, which directs the state to work towards a uniform civil code for all citizens.
Okay, so this brings us back to that big question we started with. If you can't sue the government for ignoring these principles, what stops them from just being a nice-sounding wish list? Where's the real power? How do they get enforced?
Well, the answer is right there in the Constitution itself. Article 37 says it all. It starts by saying, yep, you can't enforce these in court, but then it immediately says they are nevertheless fundamental in the governance of the country. And here's the kicker. It says it is the duty of the state to apply them. That's a powerful word. It's not a suggestion. It's a constitutional duty.
So here's how it actually works in the real world. This is the enforcement mechanism. It's not a legal process, it's a political one. If a government consistently ignores these guiding principles, their policies might not help people. That can lead to public anger and dissatisfaction. And what's the ultimate check on a government? The voters. The real enforcer of the directive principles is public opinion and the power of the ballot box.
Finally, it's so important to see that these principles aren't just some old text frozen in time. They're a living, breathing, evolving vision for India's future. And this evolution has been shaped not just by politicians adding amendments, but also by decades of Supreme Court rulings trying to find that perfect balance between our individual rights and our collective goals. Over the years, Parliament has added new directives to keep up with the times. Things like environmental protection and free legal aid came in with the 42nd Amendment. But the courts have played a huge role too. In landmark cases like Kesavananda Bharti, the Supreme Court said you can't destroy the basic structure of the Constitution. Later in the Minerva Mills case, the court made it clear the balance between fundamental rights and directive principles is part of that basic structure. You can't just throw one away for the other. They have to work together in harmony.
You want the perfect example of how this all works? Look at the right to education. The original Constitution, in Article 45, said the state should provide education. For decades, it was a goal, a directive. But as India grew and developed, that goal became an absolute necessity. So, the 86th Amendment came along and turned that directive into a legally enforceable fundamental right. This is the ultimate journey for a DSPP, to go from being a goal for tomorrow to a guaranteed right for today.
So we'll end on this thought. The directive principles are like a bridge between the India that we are today and the India that we aspire to be. Some of those goals, like the right to education, we've managed to achieve, but others, like the Uniform Civil Code in Article 44, are still on the distant shore. And that leaves us with a really important question. What will it take, economically, socially, and politically, for today's directives to become tomorrow's fundamental rights?